Hi everybody, welcome back. This is chapter 18, and the name of this chapter is called Mukwa's Wigwam. If you remember, we're at Grand Portage right now. So the brigade, 5 Montreal canoes, is at Grand Portage, and they're taking a break before they make the return trip back to Montreal. So they're at the fort, okay? And Pierre's learning about how the fur trade works while they're taking their break, getting ready to go back. So he's hanging out with the guys from his canoe and learning a few things about the fur trade. So as he's learning about how the fur trade works, so will we. All right. So how long will we be staying at the fort? Pierre asked Charbonneau the next morning. After complaining about too many questions before breakfast, Charbonneau explained that their layover would last a week. He told Pierre the crew would reassemble, less Commander McKay and several others who were taking the trade goods north. The Montreal canoes would bring baled furs back to Lachine, which is a small town right next to Montreal, while the north canoes headed into the wilderness. All right, so this is how the fur trade works. We're going to find out a little bit in this chapter how exactly this fur trade works, a little bit more detail. So right here's a small example. So what they brought out with them, they're going westbound from Montreal to Grand Portage, right? So if I can show you a map, that would be great. So here's our map right here. So they traveled westbound from Montreal, Ottawa River, remember? Down the French River, down Lake Huron, up the Sault Ste. Marie, up through Lake Superior, over to Grand Portage. Now on this trip, westbound, they're carrying with them in the canoes manufactured goods. Okay? And we're going to talk about what these manufactured goods consisted of during this chapter. I'm talking stuff like pots, pans, kettles, muskets, musket balls, gunpowder, knives, hatchets, sewing needles. These are all products made of metal. Native Americans didn't have a way to make items out of metal. The Europeans did. So the Europeans needed fur. They didn't have any fur left in Europe. It had been trapped out, hunted out. Native Americans had the fur. Europeans had the manufactured goods. So what did they do? They traded. Thus became the age of the fur trade, about 250 years. So what they're doing here is they've carried the manufactured goods westbound to Grand Portage, unloading their canoes, taking a break for about a week, and then they'll load up with bales, 90-pound bales of beaver furs, and take those back east. All right? Back to Montreal. So during his vacation from battling, Pierre wandered through the fort and the encampments. Though he ran an occasional errand for Charbonneau or La Petite, he had excuse me, boys and girls. Oopsie. He had a lot of free time. McKay, mainly, he listened to the old timers and learned as much as he could about the century-old trading system of the Northwest Territory. One afternoon, Pierre was helping La Petite sort through a load of trade goods. The big fellow tossed him one of the famous Northwest trading muskets to put on the gun rack. "Be careful," La Petite cautioned. "You're holding 20 plus in your hands." Pierre looked at the brass side plate of the gun with its familiar etched dragon, and he shook his head. How can you keep track of all those pluses? So each one of these big guns, it's called a musket, looks like a rifle, but it's not a rifle. Each one of these big guns was worth not $20, but 20 plus. One plus equaled one beaver fur. So in order for a Native American to trade for a gun, a big long gun, they had to have 20 beaver furs. Why, it's simple, lad, McKay answered. They're trading credits. 1 plus equals 1 prime beaver pelt. All our company men use the same formula. As each season begins, they give the Indian trappers credits based on the value of a prime beaver pelt. A butcher knife is worth 1 plus. You guys and girls know what a butcher knife is. It's a big, huge metal knife used to cut up meat. All right, that's worth 1 beaver pelt, or 1 plus. A woolen blanket. Everybody knows what a woolen blanket is. Those things were worth 8 beaver pelts. So if you're a Native American and you wanted a woolen blanket or a nice butcher knife, you had to give up 1 plus, or 1 pelt for the knife, plus another 8 for a woolen blanket. So far, that's 9. If you wanted a Northwest gun, you had to give up 20. And other things like kettles, hatchets, ironworks, cloth, and needles all have their own values. So we're talking a lot of beaver here, people, that were killed and traded for manufactured goods. Wow, so that's how it worked. Again, no money was exchanged between the Native Americans and these Europeans. They traded manufactured goods for furs. I hope that makes sense. So, you give the Indians trade goods before they even bring in furs? This is something else that's interesting. These Europeans would extend credit to the Native Americans. All right? We'll talk more about that later. Aye, McKay responded, it's all based on trust. I've seen some cheating done, but the whites mainly author it. If you give an Ojibwe a rifle in the fall, you can count on 20 pelts come spring. So in the fall, they would give the Ojibwe their manufactured goods. And they would not give them, the Ojibwe would not trade anything directly right then. They were in debt to the Europeans. Debt is a bad thing. You don't want to be in debt. If you want to know what debt is, ask your parents about a mortgage payment. That's a lot of fun. Don't do it. It's a long, boring discussion. I retract my statement. So anyway, but what about the other furs, Pierre asked. Well, if a prime beaver hide is 1 plus, a silver fox or a good bear hide can be worth 3 or even 4 plus. Some are worth a lot less. For example, a muskrat. It might take 8 muskrat hides to equal a single plus. It all depends. Even the grade of beaver can vary. The finest we call winter greased beaver it's caught in the cold weather when the pelt is prime. Then it's warmed by the Indians until the long hairs fall out, leaving it velvet soft. Why so much interest in the fur trade? McKay inquired. Are you thinking of wintering with us some season? So we just learned here what time of year the Native Americans hunt or trap for beaver. Is it spring? Is it summer? Fall? Or is it winter? You got it. When do animals have their longest coat of fur? That's the winter time. So that's when they hunt them down and kill them. You don't kill them in the summer. They don't have their long fur yet. Me in an outpost? Pierre reddened at the thought of becoming an Evernon. Aye, and if you don't like the bulwark, tend to your studies. We need a lot of smart fellows to keep track of the money that pours in and out of the frontier. McKay turned away. Pierre felt proud that his commander thought him smart enough to work as a clerk someday. When he considered the weight of a quill pen compared to a paddle, maybe schooling made sense after all. The trade item that McKay didn't mention Was it the one that caused the most trouble? This is rum. On only his second afternoon at the fort, Pierre watched as two fellows who had been drinking got into an argument over a woman just outside the stockade. It looked like an innocent squabble until one of the men pulled out a knife and jabbed it into his rival's kneecap. The wounded man stabbed the other fellow twice in the chest. For those of you who do not know, rum is an alcoholic drink. It's a drink that has alcohol in it, and so obviously if you consume enough of it, it will make you what's called inebriated or drunk. And then you'll be doing stupid things. That's why these guys tended to get into fights. So the speed of it was dumbfounding. The braves were standing in the sun talking. And an instant later, one was bleeding to death in the dust. With the help of his friends, the man with a gashed knee limped home, while the other was carried to the dispensary to die. The dispensary is kind of like a hospital. Later that day, the brother of the dead man, a boy of only 10 years of age, went to the house of the man who killed his brother. He pushed the muzzle of the Northwest gun through the doorway, and he pulled the trigger. There were 2 funerals the next day. Pierre got a glimpse of one of them when he and Charbonneau were walking to Mukwa's for dinner. Charbonneau paused in front of a crowded wigwam. Remember Mukwa, he's the Ojibwe chief. He was a friend of Charbonneau's. And remember, we studied the Ojibwe. A wigwam is one of their homes. Through the doorway, Pierre saw a number of Ojibwe, both male and female, clustered around the corpse. They were drinking and crying. One man sat at the feet of the corpse, staring into space, while a woman knelt at the head of the body and sobbed, pouring liquor down the dead man's throat. Those of you who do not know, a corpse is what they call a body that is dead. Corpse, yeah, and somebody was pouring liquor down the dead man's throat, excuse me. What are they doing? Pierre whispered. I'm not sure. Charbonneau shook his head. Maybe they think the dead are just as fond of rum as the living. So they walked on, and Pierre asked how he'd met Mukwa. Charbonneau chuckled. That's a strange one. I found him one winter near an outpost up on Lake Vermilion, about 19 or 20 years back. Charbonneau paused. He was just a boy, lying half dead in the snow. A Sioux war party had killed his entire family. Remember, boys and girls, we studied the Lakota, also known as the Sioux. Told you the Sioux and the Ojibwe fought constantly. They did not like each other. Though Mukwa had a musket ball in his shoulder and another in his leg. A musket ball is like a round lead bullet. He crawled across some thin creek ice and escaped. I built a fire to thaw him out and hauled him home on my dog sled. After I dug the lead out with a skinning knife, I waited for him to die, but he toughed it out. Following the custom of his people, he's been forever grateful. So when they arrived at Mukwa's wigwam, Pierre was impressed by the quiet order. His wife, 3 children, and aged mother all greeted the visitors with polite nods, but they left the talking to the chief. The meal was superb. The courses included roast venison, wild rice flavored with maple sugar, smoked trout, and a delicious stewed meat served in laced vessels molded out of white birch bark. As much as Pierre enjoyed the food, he couldn't help admiring Mukwa's oldest daughter, Kenawa, who passed dishes to the guests. Pierre expected the whole family to be dressed in gaudy clothing like their father. But Kenawa wore a simple white doeskin dress. Her eyes were deep brown and soft. Kenawa's gentle and quiet manner reminded Pierre of Celeste, It had been 6 weeks since he talked to a person of his own age. There were 100 questions he wanted to ask, but the boldest thing he brought himself to offer was a smile. A baby who was about the same age as Pierre's little brother, little sister Claire, sorry about that, Sister Claire, sat across from him during the meal. Whenever Pierre winked at the child, he grinned broadly. Keewatin has found a friend, Mukwa commented, proud that his guest paid attention to his young son. Charbonneau and Mukwa spent that evening talking about old times. Lalande's name came up more than once, and it was clear he'd been a good friend to them both. Pierre listened quietly, but when Mukwa called Lalande snakebite, Pierre asked why. Charbonneau grinned. He was deathly afraid of snakes. It's funny, too, because none of us ever knew it until we went on a scouting trip down the Red River one spring. You guys and girls remember where the Red River is? That's on the northwest boundary of the state of Minnesota. Mukwa was our guide, and we were checking out the trading possibilities. And things were going along fine until we camped on a feeder stream of the Red one night. It was a low, boggy area, but we couldn't afford to be choosy since it was getting dark. We'd no sooner pitched our tent and crawled under our blankets when Lalande let out a yelp and jumped up. A snake had tried to crawl up his leggings. We all laughed. It was just a harmless water snake, but Lalande was so riled up, he nearly pulled the tent down. To calm him, we lit a tallow candle and searched the bedding. Altogether, we found 3 or 4 of the little rascals. Ew, gross. Pierre shuddered at the thought. We threw the snakes out the door, tied the flap down tight, and got Lalande settled in. Everything would have been fine if Mukwa here hadn't played the funny man and given Lalande's big toe a hard pinch. Poor fellow. Poor fellow jumped up again, yelping, I'm bit! I'm snake bit! There's nothing to worry about, Lalande, Mukwa said. Them's just water snakes, living in those old graves down by the river. After that comment, Charbonneau shook his head and grinned. He was too spooked to even think about sleeping. Poor fellow sat up the rest of the night, staring at the tent flap, with his blanket wrapped around him, muttering, snakes and graves, snakes and graves. He caught up on his sleep the next day, Mukwa added, so Lalande could take a passable nap in the saddle, Charbonneau said, chuckling. He only fell off his horse twice all day. But that's what ended up saving our skins at the end of it all, Mukwa said. Charbonneau nodded. He and Mukwa sat in silence a moment, pondering something that had happened long ago, but the talking was done. A short while later, Charbonneau and Pierre thanked Mukwa for his hospitality. Mukwa gave Charbonneau a hug, and Pierre bowed politely to both the chief and his family. On the way back to the fort, Pierre's curiosity got the best of him. What did Mukwa mean by Lalande saving your skins, he asked. Charbonneau didn't answer right away. He began with a sigh. Well, he says, the next day, we were coming up on a ridge. When Lalande, who had been snoring for at least a mile, tumbled off his horse. Mukwa and I dismounted to help him, and then we heard some commotion just ahead. We tethered our horses and belly crawled up a hill. Below us was a Sioux war party. Remember, Sioux is another name for Dakota. Marching south, a string of ponies stretched around the ridge and clear out of sight. The faces of the warriors were splattered with grime and blood. Scalp poles were hung over their shoulders. If you ask me nicely at a Google Meets, I'll explain to you what a scalp pole was, boys and girls. I don't want to go into such detail now, but it's not a pretty sight. A long blonde cascade of hair dangled from one pole, and we were close enough to see a pearl comb still tucked in place. It turned your stomach. He took a deep breath, but the worst was the 3 little golden locks of hair on the next pole. Before we knew it, Lalonde cocked his northwest gun and drew a bead on a Sioux. It would have been suicide, but I thought he was going to fire. After the last warrior passed, Lalonde still lay there, his gun cocked, sighting on the horizon. There were tears running down his cheeks. Pierre was still thinking of Lalonde when Charbonneau changed the subject. Charbonneau whispered, "Look." He pointed towards the waning moon. Below its slender arc, star-flecked Superior stretched farther than Pierre could see. At that moment, as they stood alone in the silvery dark above the fort, Pierre remembered that he was halfway home.